Perkins, and I'm your room host for Manchester EFG today, and welcome to South. Duet. Got it?
Nope. I think it's not on.
That's not it.
Yep.
Where's our buddy? What's his name? Oh, yeah.
Is yours on now?
Got
Test,
it.
test.
Thanks.
Right.
There you go.
My name is Maggie Perkins, and I'm your room host for Manchester EFG today. Welcome to South by Southwest Intelligence Future Track. This track brings experts together to discuss AI along with other new incredible technologies. These technologies have opened up a world of amazing possibilities and sparked legitimate concerns. Before I introduce the session, let me share some housekeeping. We've scheduled lots of encore presentations for our most popular sessions, and you can find these by searching for Encore in the online schedule. If this is your first time at the conference, there's a first time to South by Southwest meetup at 5 p.m. in Ballroom EFG at the Austin Convention Center. Whether you're new or a veteran, there's a South by Southwest 2018 What You Need to Know session at 6:30 p.m. in Ballroom C at the Hilton. The opening party tonight is at Michelada's and begins at 8 p.m. Important. Continue your look into the future at Palm Park, where Mercedes-Benz and Smart have curated talks, musical acts, art installations, and food and drink. Now for the session at hand. This session is entitled What AI Reveals About Our Place in the Universe. AI reveals patterns in our bodies, behavior, and intelligence. Why do these patterns exist, and what are the implications of being so predictable? Please welcome Louis Rosenberg, founder and CEO of Unanimous AI, David Eagleman, neuroscientist from Stanford, Sean Carroll, theoretical physicist and author of The Big Picture, and Nikos Acuña, chief visionary for Sizmek. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So glad everybody came out on a Friday morning, not to just have beers and tacos, but to have your head explode right out. So I'm glad you all could make it. So just to set some context, I'm Nikos Acuña. I've moved into a lead evangelist role for the company, but have been thinking about AI for a very long time. And what interests me, first of all, Sizmek is a company that uncovers hidden patterns between consumers and brands by aligning creative media and data. And basically, we collect a lot of data and start to understand the inherent patterns between these customers and brands. And what interested me about this particular topic, not only is it a big one, but I try to connect the dots between a lot of different things. And in writing several white papers about AI, cross-industry digital transformation, and really understanding how AI is impacting various industries, I wanted to take a much broader view to understand how we're really at a creative renaissance of sorts, right? Beyond the hype cycles, beyond what AI is doing from the perspective of being able to augment our own behavior, be able to amplify our intelligence, drive business performance, and really help us understand and provide insights more than we've ever before. I think we're in a really good place now to start unpacking this conversation of intelligence itself. And I think we have three really smart guys that could definitely help me do that, right? So I thought I'd start, and each panelist will have about 7 to 10 minutes. I know it's pushing it in terms of a really big topic and covering a lot in a little amount of time, but I'd have Sean Carroll talk about some foundational principles and how we came essentially to this point in time in which we have the emergence of things like thermodynamics, chemistry, physics, and intelligence itself. And then we'll have David Eagleman, who is astute in understanding the brain. So we're going to zoom in from a microscopic point of view in terms of what intelligence could mean, what's going on in our brains. And then I'll have Louis Rosenberg talk about a more expansive point of view in terms of collective intelligence and ultimately what it could mean for us as a society, as humans, how we could design a better world. And then I hope to connect the dots from there, and then hopefully we'll leave time for questions. So with that in mind, Our first panelist, Sean Carroll. He is an award-winning, best-selling author of The Big Picture. If you guys haven't read it, I highly recommend it. He is a theoretical physicist, and he has I'd say a very crystallized view, an opinionated view of our place in the universe. Some of you may disagree, some of you may agree with him, and so I hope to challenge some of these perspectives, but I think that it'd be very productive for him to start off with a perspective on how we came to be from where we were. You don't have to start at the Big Bang, Sean, but definitely help us understand how foundational principles of physics led us to this point and how the emergence of intelligence could potentially have come about.
Sure. Thanks, Nikos. It's great to be here, my first South by Southwest experience. And I take it that my job is not so much to talk about AI, but to talk about the entire rest of the universe, to lay a little bit of context for how AI can come to be. So let me make 2 points about the universe. There's more than 2 things to say. There's more than 7 minutes worth of stuff to say about the universe. But we can make a lot of headway just by recognizing 2 features of the universe. One feature is the arrow of time, the simple fact that the past and future are different from each other. So you can remember something that happened in the past, you predict what happens in the future. This difference is so obvious and ingrained to us that we don't even think of it in our everyday lives as something that needs to be explained, right? The past has already happened, it's in the books. The future hasn't happened yet, so obviously I can make choices and my free will acts toward the future, not the past. You can decide right now that this is a boring session and you can leave, but you cannot decide not to have come a few minutes ago, right? The interesting thing is that when we look at the fundamental laws of physics, as best we've understood them since the time of Isaac Newton, there's no difference in them between the past and the future. They treat the past and future on an exactly equal footing. So what is going on? What's going on is that there's a boundary condition at the Big Bang. Gotta talk about the Big Bang, sorry. The Big Bang was very special. 14 billion years ago, the universe started in a very special state. We call it a low entropy state. It is a high level of organization, if you like, orderliness. And the entire 14 billion year history of the universe has been an evolution toward disorder and randomness. But as that disorder increases, complex structures can arise. That's the interesting thing. There's not a competition between disorderliness and complexity. In fact, when things were at the Big Bang, they were very, very low entropy, very, very organized, but also simple. In the far future, 10 to the 100 years from now, the universe will be very high entropy, but also simple. It will be nothing but empty space. Complex structures such as ourselves come to be in between. It is while entropy is increasing that complexity can come into existence. So that's the second point I wanted to talk about, which is the idea of emergence that Nikos already mentioned. When we look at the universe, in some sense, we could describe everything that's going on in the language of particle physics and quantum field theory, right? You and I are made of particles that come together in our atoms. We're made of electrons and quarks, held together and interacting with various fundamental forces of nature. But we don't talk about ourselves that way. When you meet somebody on a date and they say, "Tell me about yourself," you do not list all of your atoms and their positions and their momenta. At Caltech, they would do that. That's considered kind of hot on a first date at Caltech. But most of us would tell a higher level story, right? And this is an amazing feature of the world, that even though there's one world, the natural world, the world that science tells us about, there are many ways of talking about that world. We could speak the language of particles and forces, but there's emergent higher level ways that also give us an accurate picture. And this is just like the arrow of time, something that we take for granted but shouldn't. It's an amazing thing. In a typical physical system, if you took one little atom here and you said, "I know all of the atoms and molecules in the room, what is this atom going to do?" With perfect calculational power, I could tell you. But if I say, actually, I only know half of the atoms in the room, but not the other half, I've thrown away half of the data, I can tell you nothing about what this particle is going to do. That's the typical feature in physics, that if you throw away a little bit of the data, you lose all of your power to predict what will happen. Emergence is a feature that happens when you can throw away almost all of the information and still retain an enormous amount of predictability. When you talk about how the Earth goes around the sun, I don't need to tell you the position and velocity of every atom in the Earth. I just need to tell you its center of mass. That's all I need. I've thrown away almost all the information, and I can tell you what happens. When I talk about a person or a table or the room or things like that, I'm not giving you the microscopic data of all the individual particles, and yet I can tell an interesting story about it. That's what emergence is all about. So when we put these two ideas together, the arrow of time and emergence, we get structures that change over time in ways that we can talk about without knowing everything about them, by giving what a physicist would call a coarse-grained description of the world. And in fact, a crucial feature of this coarse graining is something called homeostasis. There's two different ways that a structure could be more or less stable. The table is stable because it's made of stable things, right? It's made of atoms in an almost crystalline pattern that hold together and give it some structural integrity. But you and I are also stable, right? We have some structural integrity to us, yet we're constantly changing. The atoms that make us up constantly flow through us over time. That's a different way to be a stable, concrete structure, a homeostatic way, and that's the more interesting way from the point of view of the panel we're talking about today. Organic things, intelligent things, come together not because they're made of static things, but because the things they're made of are held together over time, even though they're made of moving pieces. The thing that holds us together is the fact that we live in a universe that is low entropy, that gives us free energy. We get light from the sun. People say, well, what we get from the sun is energy, right? It's not exactly true. We get energy from the sun, but then we radiate it right back. The amount of energy we get from the sun is exactly equal to the amount we give back to the universe. But what we get from the sun is energy in a low entropy usable form, and then we use it up. We do photosynthesis, we chew our cud, we have conferences and things like that, and then we radiate it back into the universe in a degraded, useless form. That's what we live on. That's called metabolism or fuel, right? And that's going to be a crucial part of understanding how artificial intelligence reacts to the world. It's not just like a computer, which when you shut it down just sits there and doesn't do anything. An intelligent thing is constantly interacting with the world, learning about it, feeding off of it, and understanding how those dynamic processes come to give you an emergent thing that you would call an artificial intelligence is going to be crucial to understanding how artificial intelligence will lead us into the future.
Thank you, Sean. That was very succinct and concise as usual.
How many minutes?
So I would, yeah, and definitely spot on time-wise.
It's my thing. That's what I do.
It's your thing, for sure.
Time.
For sure. Arrow of time. So with that, I'd like to now connect the dots with David Eagleman's portion. So David, he was writing by the age of 2 and was also starting to recite and really start to understand and actually present Einstein's theories by age 12. He is a known possibilian, also a best-selling author. And what I'd like you to talk about, David, is to now connect the dots with what Sean had mentioned in terms of emergence. And if you could zoom in to the brain and help us understand what's going on in the brain. Sean had mentioned that an intelligent being is existing in time and space, and it's interacting. Therefore, it is a vector of inputs, structuring information, and then creates outputs to interact with the world. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the brain, and then maybe connect that with a broader view of intelligence, and then maybe start to talk about the difference between intelligence and artificial intelligence.
Okay, cool. So by the way, I joined this panel like 27 seconds ago, so I don't have a prepared 5 to 7 minute thing, but let me lay a few pieces of groundwork that might be useful for this conversation. So one of them is that the fact is, in neuroscience, it's a very exciting field, and we know so much more than we did 20 years ago, and yet we're still really at the foot of the mountain. So when it comes to asking questions like, what is intelligence from the brain's point of view, we're actually still at a very early stage with that. And there's plenty of debate. I mean, in the literature, some people think intelligence is the capacity to suppress distractors, and other people think it's the number of things you can hold in your head at any given time, and other people think it's your ability to put things together in a novel way, and so on. And in fact, we don't have a standard definition of intelligence that anybody agrees on. What's interesting, there was a paper in the 1920s about the IQ test, and the title was Tests Test It. Meaning you can measure intelligence in some way. I mean, the IQ test correlates to grades in school and other measures of success in life, but no one knows exactly what it is. So let me just say that as a caveat at the beginning. And hand in hand with that, our tools for measuring what's going on in the brain, we use sort of our best tool is what's called functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. And that allows us to non-invasively peer inside the brain as people are making decisions or thinking about things or being intelligent in some way or another. But essentially, it's like if you were an astronaut, up in the space shuttle and looking down on America, and you were asked, is there a big forest fire or something? You might be able to see that. But if you were asked, okay, are people happy or how's the economy doing? You wouldn't be able to say much of anything from that distance. And that's the situation we're in with fMRI. So these are just some caveats at the beginning there about thinking about intelligence in the brain and what we can and can't say. What was the first question you asked, Nikos? What was the...
So tying the emergent phenomenon of intelligence and then zooming into specifically how neurons now start to form based on the way that we interact with the world.
So this concept of emergence is very important, of course, and in all systems, whether it's in physics or in neuroscience, it's like layers of the cake where you can talk a lot about. In my case, the thing we talk about is neurons and how neurons interact, and you have 100 billion neurons in your head that are all spiking tens or hundreds of times every second of your life. So it's this enormously complicated system, and we can study that at that level. And yet, when it comes to the things that we care about at our level, like tacos and beer or conference or friends or whatever it is, it's very hard to connect those two levels often because because what we are is an emergent property of this incredibly complicated system. So complicated that every neuron in your head is connected to about 10,000 of its neighbors, and so you've got almost 1,000 trillion connections in the brain. And so that's the sense in which there's this emergence thing. So what we do is we look at neurons. We don't actually know that these are the fundamental units of computation. It might be, groups of 100 or 1,000 neurons together that do something interesting. And I know in your email to me last night, Nikos, one of the things you're interested is about how things take their shapes, like trees and river basins. And one of the areas of interest to me is how neurons look just like trees and rivers and so on. Again, this is just a caveat about how little we know. One of the things I've long been interested in is what we always do is we look at individual neurons, which looks sort of like a big tree pattern with root systems coming out of them. But what we don't really have any sense of at the moment is how these different trees interact with each other. And something that I've long suspected, but there's no evidence on this, is that it may be that there are sort of units that are not just the neuron, but actually, this tree shape plus this plus this plus this equals something of greater interest than just a single tree. Anyway, that remains to be figured out as we get better technologies that allow us to actually look at individual neurons in real life during their activity. And this is something we'll get to eventually. The technology in neuroscience keeps improving, although we're not there quite yet. So, was there anything else I should say, Nikos?
No, that's a good foundation, because I think once we talk about how individual neurons, or I guess the fMRI is actually a really good example, because we're going to better understand how individual neurons react with each other, how they potentially connect with one another. The earthworm, for instance, the Human Connectome project is taking place right now, but if you can actually, using an fMRI, I think you noted the example, Sean, before in one of your talks that an earthworm can identify itself, or it can identify itself or not, right? So it's like, I'm an earthworm, not an earthworm, so it can only classify itself. So
it's even better than that. There's
Yeah.
in the nematode, which is a little kind of
Right,
roundworm. We know what the connectome is, right?
Yeah.
It's only 300 neurons or something like that. And there's a recent study that claims that they can identify which neuron it is that is in charge of the following question. When something pokes at the nematode, is it the outside world poking at it, or is it poking at itself?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
this is the origin of self-awareness
Yes.
in consciousness, right? This little 300 neuron beastie saying, is that me, or is that just I hit a rock?
So actually, if I can say something about that, one of the difficulties in neuroscience is that we have electrodes and we put them into a system and we're measuring from a single cell. And then there's always this temptation among neuroscientists to say, I found the cell that does X.
Yeah.
Like I found the neuron that cares about Jennifer Aniston, because every time I show a Jennifer Aniston picture, it fires. But in fact, it's an entire network of things that are happening. At least, in the human brain, it's all about this giant pattern of activity, and you might happen to have stuck your electrode right in the middle of that, and so you think you found the Jennifer Aniston neuron. Anyway, it strikes me that there can't be a single neuron that tells you anything, because the whole point of that neuron is it's talking to other neurons, and other neurons are talking to it, and so on. It's part of a system, a flow of information. The other interesting thing to note about the connectome of the nematode, there are actually several very simple creatures and organisms that people have finally figured out, okay, this is the way that these 300 neurons connect together. And yet the surprising part has been how little that has actually told us. Just having the neurons and their connections, we all hoped would be the key that we needed. But in fact, neurons are really complicated. I mean, each neuron has the entire genome inside it, and it's trafficking millions of proteins around. These are inserted in the membranes. And depending on the proteins that are there, they'll react differently to the neurotransmitters. You have some neurotransmitters that act locally, some of these chemicals that sort of diffuse more broadly and change the behavior of the network. And so part of the surprise has been that we've got the 300 neurons and their connections, and yet we still can't model a nematode. We still don't know exactly what it's doing.
Yeah.
Can't read its mind, exactly.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. So in talking about how neurons interact with one another, I think now we can start to talk about these specific patterns, right? I think it's interesting that these electrical impulses are taking place in the brain through synapses and dendrites that are now starting to form. So I'll now lean on Louis, who is the CEO of Unanimous AI, and I think he could astutely draw the connection with artificial intelligence, him being a Stanford man, having his bachelor's and master's and PhD at Stanford. And so he is our astute AI expert on the panel and has a very keen understanding on how collective intelligence might now start to work. So Louis, from the perspective of what Sean and David had just shared in terms of the interactions of neurons, you don't have to force the connection between how that might start to work within the web, but it's interesting how it could now almost reflect in a self-similar pattern how we all interact with one another. And only now, through the maturity of the web, which is but 25 years old, now we could now start to understand how information is flowing, like David had mentioned, and how we could potentially utilize that to solve challenges and make predictions.
Sure. So to build off what David said, I'll start out with saying a kind of a controversial statement in the world of AI, which is that people are really, really smart. In fact, if I look out and look at a room full of hundreds of people, every single person in here has 100 billion neurons in your heads. Those neurons are connected to thousands of others, so there's 1,000 trillion connections. That's remarkable computing power. But also, as I look out and I see these hundreds of people, I can't help it, but I know that if I could connect you all together, you would be way smarter. And that's because at Unanimous AI, what we do is we build hive minds. We basically build systems of people with real-time feedback loops so that we can connect them together and they can think together as a system and converge on answers and intelligence in ways that they couldn't do alone. We make people smarter together than alone. And I'll give you an example just from this weekend, and then I'll talk about how this relates to our place in the universe. So this weekend was the Oscars, and as we do at Unanimous AI, we're always building hive minds of people connected over the internet with real-time feedback loops. And so this weekend we built a hive mind of just 50 people from around the country to predict the Oscars. And so they connect, and we had them predict each of the different categories. But we also have them predict as individuals so we can see the effect, the amplification, the ability of having people think together as an emergent system. And so as individuals, they were 60% accurate in predicting the Oscars. And that doesn't sound that great, but predicting the Oscars is pretty hard. There's a lot of categories, there's a lot of choices for each category, and so they were 60% accurate. Then we had them think together as a system, connected by feedback loops, so a new intelligence emerged, a collective intelligence, and predicting together as a system, they were 94% accurate. The same exact people, when working together on their own, who were 60% accurate, when they were thinking together as a system, were 94% accurate, which is pretty amazing because these were just average movie fans. These were not experts, and yet they performed better than every expert who published predictions. They performed better than the LA Times, they performed better than Variety, the Hollywood Reporter, and it goes to show that there is this power in creating systems. And so when I now connect back to what does this say about our place in the universe, when I started looking into this topic of hive minds 10 years ago, I looked to nature. And nature shows us that social species evolve in this very specific way. First thing that happens is they develop brains, which, as David told us, is this connection of neurons that form systems, and they form these remarkably dense systems where intelligence emerges. But at some point, they reach the capacity of their brain. They reach the capacity of their brain because their head has a certain size. And what nature has done, what evolution has done in almost every social species, is then continue to build intelligence not by connecting neurons together, but by connecting organisms together. And biologists call this swarm intelligence. And it's the reason why birds flock and fish school and bees swarm. They are smarter together than alone. And so let me give you an example, which is honeybees. Now, honeybees are a great example because they're really, really simple, partly because their heads are so small, right? Their brains could only grow to a certain size, and then they couldn't grow anymore because they have to fly around. And so a honeybee has less than 1 million neurons in its head. Its brain is smaller than a grain of sand. Very, very simple organism, and yet they have very difficult problems to solve, complicated problems that would be challenging for us. So how did nature solve this problem? By enabling honeybees to form a swarm intelligence. And so here's an example that's very well understood. Every year, honeybees need to solve this difficult problem. They need to find a new home to move into. And that new home could be a hole in a log, or the hole in the side of a building, or if you're unlucky like I was, the crawl space in your garage. And the way they do this, and again, they're functioning as a superorganism. The way they do this is they send out hundreds of scout bees that search 30 square miles of area to find candidate sites. And they find dozens of candidate sites. And I like to think of this as they are a superorganism. This is the sensory part of their superorganism is out there searching the world, finding dozens of candidate sites to move into. Now, that's the easy part. The hard part is that they bring this information back to the colony, and now they need to pick the best possible site to move into. Now, this might sound simple, but it's actually really hard because honeybees are very discriminating in when they pick a home. They need to pick a new home that's large enough to store the honey they need for the winter. It needs to be ventilated well enough to stay cool in the summer. It needs to be insulated well enough to stay warm on cold nights. It needs to be near a good source of water. It needs to be really very well positioned near a good source of pollen. This is a complex, multivariable problem. If you were a human CEO trying to find the perfect location for a new factory, it'd be very difficult to solve this problem with all these competing constraints. And yet biologists have shown that honeybees can find the best possible solution over 80% of the time. They're solving a problem that a human brain could not solve easily, and they're doing it with brains the size of a grain of sand. How do they do that? They do that by forming a swarm intelligence, basically a brain of brains that's thinking together as a system. They're bringing all this information together, they're thinking together as a system, and they're converging together on the best possible solution. Now, I know what you're thinking, like these are honeybees, like how do they think together as a system? The way honeybees evolved to do it is they actually vibrate their bodies. Biologists call it a waggle dance, because to us it looks like the bees are dancing, but they're generating vibrations. They're generating signals that represent their support for the various home sites under consideration. And by combining these signals, the bees engage in this system, this real-time system, pushing and pulling, and they converge together as a system on a solution, and it's almost always the best possible solution. So that's how honeybees do it. The same thing has been seen in birds and bees and fish and all kinds of social organisms, and in fact, it's universal. That's the path that social organisms take. So for me, as a researcher, when I started looking at this 10 years ago, the big question was, well, if birds and bees and fish can amplify their intelligence by thinking together in systems, why can't people do it? And it turns out that people can do it. We just need to have the right technology to enable us to form these emergent systems. And that's what we do at Unanimous AI. We connect people online so that they can think together as a system. Humans don't know how to waggle dance like bees, so we've created these other interfaces that allow people to create these same kinds of connections. But when we do that, we find that people get smarter, significantly smarter. And in fact, we are now convinced that humans as a species can get significantly smarter by taking this idea of a brain to this next level, to this idea of a brain of brains. And it goes back to what Sean said about these self-organizing systems, and these are, it is just part of this natural order that we're going down, creating these more complicated, more sophisticated systems. And so when I look to the future and say, well, what does this relate to our place in the universe? I would say that we, as a species, are on this path to form tighter and tighter systems, to think together in larger and larger groups, and to get smarter and smarter together. And I would even say that if we look at where we are as a society, it could be the reason we've put thousands of communication satellites into orbit and put receivers into every single person's pocket in this room. In fact, billions of receivers to every single person on the planet, is because we're heading down this path of being able to think together in systems, becoming smarter together, in some ways very much the way that the birds and the bees and the fish have already done before us.
Thank you, Louis. I appreciate that. So I'm going to come back here in a second, Sean. But David, I think you can comment on now taking your hat off as a neuroscientist and putting your hat on as an inventor, entrepreneur. I believe you can comment on Louis's topic and insight on kind of your broader view on what sensing and thinking is, because you came from a perspective in which you understand the limitations of our own perception. You understand that we're very limited in our view, and you started a company that focuses on being able to broaden what sensing and thinking is, using more data and using a new means to connect with one another. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, something that's been of great interest to me for a long time is that, we open our eyes and our ears and we see reality out there and we say, great, I'm seeing all of reality, but in fact what you're seeing is a very tiny slice of what's going on. So just as an example, if you take the electromagnetic spectrum, light, what we see is less than a 10 trillionth of that, and we call that visible light on the spectrum, but all the other stuff is the same thing, it's just different wavelength, radio waves and X-rays and cosmic rays, and all this stuff is passing through your body. It's completely invisible to you. Why? Because you don't have specialized biological receptors to pick up on that. You can only pick up on this little slice of stuff. So we see the visible light around us. We say, great, that's reality out there. But in fact, you're missing most of it. And it's the same with all of our sensory perception. And we, unlike many other animals, we don't have the ability to detect the magnetic orientation of the Earth like birds and bees and insects do, and we can't pick up, we don't have electroreception like a lot of fish and other creatures do, so we can't tell perturbations in electrical fields and so on. So because that's not part of what we can see, we just sort of assume it's not there, and we're content with our reality. So this company I started called Neosensory is all about how we can tap into different data sources and expand the reality that we're perceiving. So what we did is we built a vest that's covered in vibratory motors, like the buzzer in your cell phone, but lots of them. And we can translate any kind of data stream into patterns of vibration. We've also built a wristband that has fewer motors, that has 8 motors, but it can do the same thing at a lower resolution. And so just as an example, just to make clear what we do, one thing we can do now is we can cure deafness. So for people who are born deaf, we just translate sound into patterns of vibration. People who are deaf can come to understand those signals, because that's all your inner ear is doing, by the way. It's just picking up on sound waves, breaking it into different frequencies, sending it off to your brains, doing the same thing but on your torso, shipping it off to your brain, and people come to understand the language of that. But what's even more interesting to us is things like, can you actually develop a perception of the stock market? If I'm passing in data about 32 different stocks, can you develop a sense of the economic movements of the planets? We've done things with drone pilots, for example, where they're feeling the pitch, yaw, roll, orientation, and heading of their drone as it's going. So it's like they've extended their skin onto the drone, and what it feels, they feel. And drone pilots can learn how to navigate at night or in the fog or things like that. We've got lots of different projects, just as one example with people with prosthetic legs. They have a hard time learning how to walk with a prosthetic leg because they can't feel it, of course. They don't get any feedback from it. So we just hooked up pressure and angle sensors to the leg, and we feed that into the vest, and then they're feeling their leg. They know exactly where their leg is, just the way that you do when you're walking. So we've got lots of different projects. We're also, feeding Twitter information in, thousands of tweets with a particular hashtag like South by Southwest. We can do an automated sentiment analysis on that in real time and pass in the information. So, for a politician or somebody giving a speech and being able to feel how it's landing with millions of people, it's a new kind of human experience. So this is the kind of thing we're experimenting with. We haven't yet really started down the path of doing this socially, but we've got all kinds of ideas for this. I mean, the first idea is, what if you and your spouse both wear the vest and you're feeling each other's galvanic skin response and heart rate and, state of your microbiome and all kinds of things, and would you actually feel like you are, so you're across the nation and you suddenly feel like, oh, my wife's not feeling right today or something, and you call her up and see how it's going. I don't know if this would be awful or great to have, but we'll see. Anyway, we're just starting to think about this social thing, so this is something you and I will talk about online or offline about that.
Yeah, David, thank you for that. So coming back to you, Sean, I think we could now talk about two distinct things. So there's the augmented intelligence portion. So we've talked about the implications of perhaps now augmenting our own intelligence through the technologies that we now have, right? So as Marshall McLuhan said, first we build the tools and then the tools build us. So I'll start one track there. But going back to you, Sean, I think this starts to suggest something about the nature of reality and how limited we are. I think you've talked before about how there's obviously only so much that we can know, but at the level of protons, photons, electrons, quarks, atoms, you've mentioned before that there's no more that we can understand, fundamentally speaking, at that level. So that's it. So there's a finite amount of knowledge that we can gather from that, even though there's still a lot more to understand about how those particles can maybe combine to create new emergent patterns. So could you tie that with maybe the nature of reality and kind of how you suggested that before?
Yeah, just to be clear, it's a dramatic understatement to say that there's still a lot to be learned about how protons, neutrons, and electrons can come together in new and interesting ways, right? That's like literally everything that everyone except for professional particle physicists thinks about every day is how these particles can come together in new and interesting ways. And so, for example, so what Nikos is referencing is the idea that in this universe we describe using many emergent levels, there is one level which is made out of the particles that you and I are made out of, okay? It's the world where we talk about electrons and protons and so forth. And there's a remarkable fact that we understand that level perfectly. We understand the basic rules. We understand the laws of physics underlying our everyday lives. All the words in that sentence are very important, so let me just emphasize them. I'm not saying we understand the laws of physics, period. There's plenty we don't understand. We don't understand what happened at the Big Bang, what goes on inside black holes, what the dark matter is, etc. There's plenty that we don't understand, more than plenty we don't understand, about every other level. right? Whether it's chemistry, biology, psychology, et cetera. We're nowhere near understanding all of these immersion levels. But the point is that as far as fundamental particles go, there are certainly ones that we haven't discovered, but none of the ones we will eventually discover will ever be found to be relevant to you or me in what is going on in our biology or our brains. We know that. We know it because if there were new particles, new forces, we have ways of detecting them. And we looked, and they're not there. This is a very wonderful feature of the fundamental laws of physics, that they're a little bit rigid. It's not anything goes. If a new particle could come in and affect what's going on in my brain, there's a symmetry. I could take the particles that make up my brain, shake them, and make this new particle. And I know what particles make up my brain. It's protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? So smashing particles together is what particle physicists do for a living. We've looked for new particles. So this is actually reflected, and this is a slightly scary, bad thing that we don't talk about very much, but new advances in technology are not driven by discoveries in fundamental physics anymore. The last discovery in fundamental physics that had a technological application was roughly in the 1950s. That doesn't mean that we're done with technology or innovation, but it's a matter of putting together the atoms that we know about in new and interesting ways. If we make new particles, they will just decay away very, very quickly. We made the Higgs boson, we discovered that in 2012. You make a Higgs boson and it disappears in 1 zeptosecond, which is a very short period of time. And you need an $11 billion particle accelerator to even make the Higgs boson in the first place. So there will never be a Higgs boson-powered iPhone. It's just not practical for that. So instead, the way that innovation happens is by putting together those fundamental ingredients in new and interesting ways. And we're running out of time here to talk about all the new and interesting ways, but something that's relevant to the discussion is the idea of thinking not of matter, but of information. Information theory is beginning to suffuse and take over large parts of fundamental physics because we're realizing that it sort of is less important what stuff is made out of than of what certain things know about certain other things. It's a fascinating question to ask, when did information as a concept first become useful and interesting in the history of the universe? If you see, information is basically a way of talking about correlations between two different things. If you see a footprint in a fossil bed, that's information because the footprint reflects the shape of the foot, right? But the early universe was just smooth and homogeneous and boring. There was nothing that reflected anything else. So it's part of this arrow of time, increase of entropy, increase of complexity story that different parts of the universe start to have information about each other and can then start to process that information and do thinking and become intelligent.
Absolutely. So that's a good point right there. So I think, Louis, it's a good way to connect the dots to AI there. In terms of information theory, all our brains are doing essentially are, 1, recognizing patterns, and 2, predicting the future, just if we talk about it at just the individual chunks of neurons that are interacting with one another. And you, a person who's created AIs that can essentially model what the brain is doing, to create predictive models to decipher some type of output or get to some type of output. Can you maybe draw the connection between the information that is being structured in the brain and how that could essentially suggest how we could do better with how we make decisions and how that could suggest how we could augment our own intelligence, either at an individual level or the collective level as well?
Sure. So at Unanimous AI, we think about predictions all the time, and we really ponder what kind of information is needed. And when we look at just a single individual, they have limited information, and they also have certain biases. For example, when we predict sports all the time, and when we do that, there's nobody who knows everything there is to know about sports or everything there is to know about all the different teams. And they also probably have biases towards their favorite team or biases against certain teams they don't like. And so an individual who has limited knowledge and biases makes pretty poor predictions. But when we scale that up and we say, as a society, we have thousands of people, millions of people, billions of people who have together a really deep set of information, and all their biases cancel out, we start to realize why these larger scale systems are so much smarter than individuals and can make much better decisions and predictions and forecasts. In the example I gave earlier of predicting the Oscars, for example, again, we had 50 people, and they were almost perfect, 94% accurate in predicting the Oscars. What I didn't say was that we actually asked those people, how many of those 50 people had actually seen all the movies? None of them had seen all the movies. We said, how many of you had seen half the movies? None of them had seen half the movies. Most had only seen a couple movies. But that's the thing, when you build this larger scale system, they're filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge. They're also canceling out the biases that they might have that might give them distorted types of predictions. And when you build this larger scale system and they can think together as a hive mind, they become significantly smarter because they're like the scout bees that have gone out into the world and have all brought back different perspectives and different bits of information, but together they have this holistic view.
Excellent, thank you. So David, I think something just occurred to me when you were talking earlier about how when you zoom into an individual neuron, you realize that it's just a conglomeration because you're right at the center of it being a network. And I think it was Stephen Johnson that said that an idea is a network. And he also said that chance favors the connected mind, which I thought is a very eloquent quote as well. So when you again focus on the brain itself and how individual neurons now start to take shape and form pictures in our brain. So I think it was Kurzweil that said that our brains, we can now see how our brains are creating our thoughts, how our thoughts are creating the brain. Can you kind of talk about how our brains are changing while we're thinking and interacting with the world from kind of a biological perspective, and maybe the implications for how technologies like Louis has mentioned and that you're building yourself could potentially point us toward a more abundant type future?
Yeah, so the right way to think about the brain, of course, is not like it's hardware and not like it's software, but it's what I call liveware, which is, it's constantly reconfiguring its own circuitry, and we don't build things like this. For example, if I take my cell phone and I run over half of it with my truck, it's done. It's not going to work anymore. But brains are remarkably resilient because especially in young children, I mean, there are these surgeries called a hemispherectomy. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but somebody has intractable epilepsy as a child, and the only surgery is to remove half of the brain, take out an entire half of it, and then the empty part of the skull fills up with cerebrospinal fluid and holds the other half in place. And the thing is that the kid grows up to be perfectly fine. They have a slight limp on the other side of their body, but otherwise they're completely fine. And we just don't even have any clue how to build machinery like this that rewires itself. So this is the sense in which the brain is the word for it that we have in neuroscience is brain plasticity. What that refers to is a property of the material plastic is that you can shape it in some way and it'll hold that shape. Like that's why we like a plastic bowl, because it stays as a bowl and so on. I actually think that's a pretty imperfect term, because what it implies is you mold the brain a certain way and it holds that. But the cool part about the brain is that it's constantly changing. I mean, it's constantly reshaping and remolding. And this happens your whole life. And by the way, this is what memory is about. That's why you can learn that my name is David, and a week from now you'll be able to say, oh, what was that guy's name? It was David, because there's a physical change in the structure of your brain when you learn that. And that's how you're able to pull that back out.
Thank you. So Sean, you started. I'll ask you to end before we take questions from the audience. You mentioned something earlier, I think it was in a previous talk as well, that there were 3 levels to talk about things. Obviously, the way that individual particles at the elemental level interact with one another. And then there's, for instance, the example of the iPhone. You could talk about it, in the way that the clusters of particles kind of make up the physical, tangible thing of what it is. And then there's a way to talk about it in its semiconductors and the way that integrated circuits work. And then there's a way to talk about it as a user. Yeah, it's a phone. It does great things for me. It tells me where to go. Try to connect the dots with that and a broader view of what you mentioned earlier about information theory, because we can talk about how the hierarchy of the brain organizes things into lower level things, into higher level, more abstract patterns. And I think this starts to suggest something about our place in the universe. And they might start to suggest something intrinsic or inherent.
Yeah, I think that there's many more plausibly than 3 levels about which to talk about things. The wonderful thing about this universe that appears to us as a series of layers is we're not really sure what the best layers are, the best way to divide up the universe. When you start doing what Louis is doing and hooking up together individuals into a collective kind of organism, when does it become more appropriate to call the bee colony the organism, the unit of thinking about it, rather than the individual bees, right? When will that happen with human beings? When we all have neural laces and we're all communicating over the internet more or less instantaneously, and you don't need to dial your phone, you can just call up people and visualize them right away. At what point does it make sense to talk about a collection of human beings as the organism rather than the individual people? And there is, in fact, an information theory way of thinking about this question. There's at least a theory proposed by Giulio Tononi and others called integrated information theory. And they basically are asking, if you have some different set of ways to group a bunch of things together, which is the way in which you sort of get the most information out at that level of coarse graining, at that level of grouping things together. And they try to propose that, for a person, it's typically one person is a good unit of consciousness. It was their focus of what they're doing. But sometimes there's mob-like behavior where it might be more sensible to talk about the mob as having a psychology and motivations and so forth, rather than the individuals. And sometimes that's bad. Maybe it will be good someday. Maybe that's the right way to think about it. Certainly, we often think about countries or cities or groups of people as having their own motivations. We attribute personality traits to them, etc. And honestly, as physicists or as information theorists, we're not that good yet at figuring out where those lines should be drawn. I think that's a very interesting future project for us to think about.
Yeah, no doubt. I find it very interesting that there's just a big leap that we take between all of the individual clusters, the bits of information, and how they create a sum that is greater than, or a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So we have some time for questions. Anybody? There's a lot of ground that we covered. Yeah, please use the mic over there. Go ahead.
Right here, if you'd like to step up.
Yeah, just walk over there. Yeah.
Hello. So I have a 2-part question. The first part is I would like to know each of the panelists' opinion on substrate independence, which is whether the subjective experience that all of us have today can emerge from something that is not biological. And the second part of my question is specifically for Sean Carroll. If substrate independence is true, is it possible to say that if time has an arrow, maybe intelligence is the bullseye? If that makes sense.
It does. You want me to answer first?
Go for it.
So, number 1, read my book. Number 2,
I have it, and I want you to sign it.
okay. Give it as presents to other people then. Yeah, I'm basically a believer in substrate independence because I think that intelligence or consciousness is a collective phenomena that doesn't care whether you're made of neurons or transistors, etc. But to the second part of the question, I would say no, because I think that I would say mostly no. It's a subtle question about the directedness of evolution through time, whether it's a physical system or biological systems. The laws of physics have no directedness. They have no teleology. They don't care where we're going. Evolution has no directedness. It has no teleology. It just wants to recreate more copies of the genome in the population that is going on right now. Intelligence is sometimes useful in some circumstances, but it's not a goal of evolution or anything like that. It could be our goal, but it's not the universe's goal. It could go away. We're frighteningly close to making it go away sometimes, I worry. There are certainly things that evolution has stumbled upon, like eyesight in particular species, that have later gone away as they appeared not so useful. So I think that it's a little bit anthropocentric or right now-ocentric to think of intelligence as something toward which things are going in any necessary way.
Thank you.
As far as the substrate independence question goes, just to clarify for everyone, it's just this question of could you take what's happening in the brain and reproduce it out of on a machine made of beer cans and tennis balls? Would it be intelligent and conscious like we are? We don't actually know the answer to that yet. I think the general idea in the community, of course, is that neurons are physical things, and so there should be no reason that you couldn't do that, because what matters presumably is the algorithm that's being run rather than the detailed cells on which Mother Nature had to work with. That is the majority view. We don't actually know that that's true. There may be certain special things going on with neurons that are going to take us a long time to figure out. Part of the reason for just maintaining that little bit of skepticism about it is just because there's so many very deep questions. I mean, to my mind, the most central question in neuroscience is, why are we conscious? Why is it like something to be us? Because we can imagine building, a garage door opener or a computer or whatever that does very sophisticated algorithms, but we don't have any reason to think that it is conscious, that it is like something to be it. And so when we're faced with mysteries like this, we can say, well, we're just going to sweep that under the rug, or we say, well, maybe integrated information theory is going to answer that. But we don't really know for sure why we have that. So anyway, that's the only reason for wondering whether there's something about the substrate that's quite special.
My view is less skeptical or less uncertain. I feel pretty certain that there's nothing limiting intelligence from being outside of a biological substrate. In fact, I think it's certain to happen because we humans are trying to make it happen, and unless we go away, we will make it happen. And so, in fact, my view is that that's scary because once that does happen and intelligence is outside of biological substrate, then that new intelligence won't care very much about biology anymore, and we become at risk. And one of the things about our biological substrate is that it's limited to the size of our heads. And once you go outside of that and you can build an intelligence in any substrate, it will quickly exceed our capacity. And that's actually one of my motivations for saying, we humans are going to get outclassed pretty soon by other intelligences, but we can stay in the game by coming together in systems. We escape the limits of the size of our brain by forming systems. There are billions of us, and we can get many, many, many times smarter by thinking together. So my view is, as someone who works in the field of AI, I'm very worried about a future where a completely non-biological intelligence emerges. I see it as basically no different than an alien intelligence showing up from outer space, and it will be just as much of a risk. And so I'm very much on the side of humans, and I hope that we humans keep our intelligence relevant, and the one path that I see for doing that is by thinking together in systems.
Thank you. That was a big two-part question. We have time for maybe one more? Yeah, one more.
I was just curious, since you had mentioned some of the sensory abilities of other species, whether you think that hive intelligence is cross-species, especially with companion animals or other, species that have co-evolved with humans.
So you're asking about, can we form a swarm intelligence with other species? It's a really interesting point and something I hadn't never really thought much about, but I do think that your point about other species that have co-evolved with humans is interesting because like dogs, for example, we have the ability to read their faces. They have the ability to read our faces. That's unique among very few other species that can actually do that. And one of the natural ways that we humans have for forming very, very simple collective intelligences is through this ability to perceive and read others. It triggers mirror neurons in our own heads, and we start to form these very simple systems. And I suspect we do that with with other species that we've co-evolved with.
And I'll just add that we can add, because we can add new senses to a human, for example, we're building a molecular detector that gives a person a sense of smell like a dog. And so there's going to be really interesting ways in which, as we add to ourselves electroreception and magnetoreception and better smell and ultraviolet and infrared, we'll essentially be taking all the things that other animals can do and being able to stick that all in one brain.
Thank you. Sorry, we don't have time for your question, but please feel free to come up to the panelists after. Thank you guys for your time on this Friday. We hope we made your heads explode. Now go have some beer and tacos. Thank you, Jens.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Great.
Sure.
David, thanks for being a good sport. I appreciate you just freestyling with us.
Totally.
Hi.
The importance of the internet in terms of our human capacity to become a superhuman. Right. Okay. Here we go.
1/10 of the.
Less than a 10 trillion, yeah.
Is there an upper limit?
No, there's not. So, yeah, good question. There's